Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we want to ask a simple question. Are there novels that encapsulate the ideas contained in hundreds, thousands of other novels, and in fact in films and series as well? Are there novels that contain so many ideas that are found everywhere else that you could say they almost originated some of the patterns and cultural references that we are still living with today? Well, in order to answer that question, or at least partly answer that question, we want to take the example of a pretty famous book, a 1970 science fiction novel by Ira Levin called This Perfect Day. Now, Ira Levin is well known in general, of course. He wrote This Boy from Brazil and Rosemary Baby, of course, which famously was made into a film as well. And so he's not a small-time, obscure, second-rate type of writer, or at least he is well known and has sold many novels. And This Perfect Day is sort of a classic in science fiction. And it is very interesting for us to look at a couple of aspects of that novel, to ask ourselves the question again, well, what's in that novel that we perhaps find afterwards again and again and again? Now, the idea, the premise of This Perfect Day is very simple. And like many of the aspects of that novel, when I tell you about them, you will immediately think about another novel you've read, or maybe 10 novels you've read, a film you've seen, a series you've watched. Believe me, the references will be immediate for you as well. So the setting of This Perfect Day is very simple. It's a community which is geographically undefined, more or less in the beginning. Then we understand that they are still the old continents, America, Europe, India, which is not a continent, but those denominations have sort of changed. So in the beginning it's a little bit unclear where we are or which part of the world we're in, but we soon understand that it doesn't really matter because the whole world is basically one giant country, as it were. So there are no, or at least in the beginning, there are no parts of the world which is substantially different from other parts of the world, at least as far as we can tell as readers. And we start off by being introduced to that society, which is basically a socially engineered society, where the main aspect, I guess, is that in order to, let's say, have peace and harmony among people in the world, well, those people have been, let's say, organized, and their level of individuality has been drastically reduced. What does that mean? Well, it means that your typical social structures, like the family, etc., have sort of disappeared. That weakly inhabitants of those cities of the world really have to take some drugs, supposedly for their good, of course, to help them combat, I don't know, disease and infections. In fact, diseases have mostly disappeared. Death has mostly disappeared, except that at 62 you have to go and, well, die. That is a very interesting aspect, which is unfortunately not really elaborated on, perhaps like quite a few aspects in that novel. But basically, the life of a person, or what is a person? Well, a person has 2 legs, 2 arms, etc., and 62 years. There is no rebellion because the social engineering also goes into, of course, well, enculturation, or that is the imposition of a very strict cultural framework, let's say, on everybody's life. What does that mean again? Well, it means that you are assigned jobs. There are absolutely no differences between the genders. Everybody does a type of job. Sex has disappeared as a recreational activity. It is obligatory for everyone to have sex once a week with a sexual partner or any partner. It will not last long, and there is no love, there is no affection involved. It is one of the functions of the body, bodily function like any other, that has to be discharged, but it is not associated with any feeling. By this time, you are beginning to think that perhaps this reminds you of, for example, The Giver, a classic young adult novel by Lois Lowry. Highly recommended, in fact, it is very good. Which basically postulates the exact same type of society, except that in The Giver, she pushed it even further by removing all aspects of any type of variation, as it were. So there are no mountains, because it's too high. There are no big lakes or oceans. Everything has been erased. Everything has been leveled up completely. And it is the same in the Ira Levin novel, This Perfect Day. And this is the setup. Basically, everyone is under surveillance all the time, both by a sort of unseen power, government or council, however you want to call it, and a mega supercomputer that basically organizes everybody's life. And which is idolized almost. It almost has the status of a god. And the other side of the surveillance is the internal one. Basically, everybody has to report on everybody else for their own good, of course. And so should you deviate from any norm, and there are many, and they are very strict, then of course it is entirely possible that somebody will report you for it. Not because they're mean or they want anything negative happening to you, but because they genuinely want to rescue you. Now, as usual in those types of novels, what will happen is that the main narrator will sort of discover, be introduced to a group of rebels. Rebels, that is, people who have understood that this type of life is not what they want. They can escape it. They can escape surveillance by living more at night, by evading the computers and scanners that are everywhere, and again, keeping an eye on everybody's movement. And our narrator will start hanging out with those people, rebel against them, or the powers rather, and will finally find that there are more rebels in the world than he thought, and that some of them even have their own place to live. Now, there will be more plot twist. There will be a major plot twist, and it is very probable that about that stage, that last plot twist will remind you immediately of the movie The Matrix and its sequels, because it is basically exactly what happens in The Matrix, which happens in This Perfect Day. I will not spoil it for you, but it is the exact same thing. In fact, it is quite noticeable that when our narrator, our main protagonist, meets this little group of semi-rebels, he is given a choice between two sorts of pills. One which will keep him indoctrinated, as it were, dormant and unaware of the reality of the world. The other one which will start suppressing the effect of the official drugs he has to take. And of course that reminds you of The Matrix as well, and the famous scene with Neo being offered the two pills, one that awakens him to the reality of the world and one which keeps him unaware of that very reality. Now, this idea of social engineering, of course, goes back a very long way. You don't really have to know a whole awful lot to have heard of Brave New World, for example, the Huxley novel. Brave New World, as you know very well, is typically related to, opposed to, contrasted with 1984 by Orwell. And over the last few decades, it had become evident that the Huxley novel was more relevant to our societies than the Orwell one. This may be changing slightly now, of course, but the Huxley one, I remind you, is the suppression of a collective identity and a need for individuality through basically entertainment and the suppression of thought and critical thought. And it is, of course, what happens here as well, the constant surveillance, the constant spying, both from the authorities, whoever they are, and your fellow townspeople, makes it a heavily regulated society in which it is impossible to think differently from what is required of you to think. There are very few sources of knowledge, there are no historical sources, there is no information except, of course, authorities approved information about the past. In other words, again, just like a book like The Giver, all those people in the Ira Levin novel live the life that they're supposed to live, that they are required to live, and they have lost something. Now, that is, of course, when this book becomes a little bit more interesting, because as a novel, some aspects of it have not aged very well, and I will come back to that in a second. The first thing, of course, is that typically in those novels, there is a symbolic level. And the symbolic level here is definitely the opposition between a happy, utopian, at peace collective, world collective. Everybody's equal, there are no wars, there is no cruelty, there are no aggressive behaviors, there is no violence, people do not know violence, people do not know what being mean to someone is, even orally. There is no physical aggression, it's unknown. In other words, a utopian society where the only thing missing, perhaps, is freedom of choice at the level of the individual. And that, of course, is typically opposed to, well, that freedom of the individual, and typically speaking again, and certainly very strongly in this book, what is the nature of mankind, or humankind. What is our essence? What made us and what makes us us? Well, Ira Levin obviously concludes what makes us us is our individuality. It is our ability to think creatively, to be different, to imagine, to progress, to move on, to discover, to improve. And all this, all those qualities, as it were, are anchored in our individuality and the ability that we have to be different from one another. Now, in a book like The Giver, for example, it is very clear that difference is the source of all evil. Difference in color, difference in height, difference in belief, difference in whatever. Everything is a source of potential conflict, and therefore the source of disagreement and a source of potentially wars. So, in The Giver, by Lois Lowry, everybody's alike, and there are no strong emotions allowed, basically. Love, hate, all those things are out. You cannot express them because you don't know about them. In This Perfect Day, it is the same idea. And very clearly, there lies the problem for Ira Levin, which is, well, this type of society, it may be utopian, it may be wonderful, there are no conflict, there are no wars, but there are also at the same time no strong emotions, no memories of the past, no understanding of the nature of mankind, whatever it is, of course, no desires, no strong ambitions, no progress, no development. Basically, he sees such a utopian society as stagnant and ultimately futile and meaningless. It's at this stage, of course, that we remember that 1970, the date of publication of that novel, the world was slightly different, or at least it was very different in many respects, and very alike in others, of course. And it is very clear here that we have a sort of historical reference to the communism camp against the American, or let's say Western camp. In other words, this utopian collective identity suppresses individuality, just like Russia was doing at the time, of course. USSR at the time it was, before the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. It was a highly repressive society in which individuality was not really tolerated, in the sense that it would differ substantially from what was accepted. So there was no freedom of press, there was no freedom of expression, there was no freedom of religion or belief. It was a heavily regulated society. Of course, the surveillance, the spying also reminds us of KGB in USSR, or, of course, in East Germany, or in all those communist republics at the time. And so it is very interesting here to see that when you look at Matrix, the Matrix is not so much about that as the opposition between the real world, let's say, and our desire, or perhaps our need to inhabit a real world, not a world of shadows, a platonic world of shadows. Whereas, of course, Levin is much more interested in saying, look, this communism business, this is no good. This is where we're going. What we need in order to be free is, well, to have that freedom, because that freedom is the source of our greatness, as it were. So you can imagine, of course, that in a novel, the main narrator, the protagonist, will eventually, of course, rebel against the system and come into conflict with the system, and I'll let you discover the end of that novel. So it's very much a novel of its time, and it is perceptible again in some of these aspects that have aged not very well. For example, the protagonist's discovery of, let's say, gender differences, because the official drug suppresses all libido and all sorts of real sexual desire. So when he awakens to that world of sexual desire, of course he wakes up as a full-blown heterosexual. That's to be expected, I guess, but his conduct with women would be difficult to write about in this way today, I think. And equally, I find that the response of the women towards his very masculine, very physical approach is surprisingly anchored in that time for somebody who may have tried to imagine something else than the world he was living in. And that's also could make you rather uncomfortable the way they react. It's only a couple of lines here and there, but it is noticeable nonetheless. In those novels, of course, you have to remember, both in this one or in A Giver, that gender being one source of difference, one difference is one source of potential conflict, and so, of course, genders are completely equal. There are no differences in their jobs or in their reactions or in their being, really. When those differences reappear, the world that reappears with it is very much a pre-Me Too world as well. Now, of course, ultimately, this novel is interesting mostly because in it we find so many tropes, so many aspects of those sort of situations that will reappear time and again in our cultural objects, be it films and series or, of course, the written novels and short stories. I mentioned A Brave New World and 1984. There is an echo of both, in a way, in a second-rate novel, I have to warn you, but still the premise is so interesting that it would be criminal not to mention it. That's Philip Joseph Farmer's Day World from 1985. You know Farmer, of course, The Fabulous Riverboat, this incredible series. In this one, the premise is so incredible that just for that, you have to buy the book. It may not be the greatest novel you've ever read, but it is very interesting nonetheless. Of course, from that time, around the Ira Levin's book, perhaps one of the influences for it, certainly it must have been an influence for The Matrix, is Logan's Run, a very much derided sort of sci-fi movie from 75, 76. But think about films like Gattaca, for example, or even another trope that is not really present here, but of course strongly related, the trope of the post-apocalyptic world, where you've got an isolated city under a dome, or in fact the dome itself that falls on an area somewhere and isolate people from the outside world. In other words, how does such a society construct itself, knowing that there is a further reality, a real reality somewhere out there, but they have no access to it. So, of course, I will close by mentioning one thing, which is tangential, but still interesting to me. The translation of this novel, This Perfect Day, in French is un bonheur insoutenable, which translates basically as an unbearable happiness. Which I think is very revealing of how perhaps publishing houses approach their job. This Perfect Day is neutral in that sense. I mean, it's utopian sounding, of course, but it is neutral. It doesn't foreshadow anything. But un bonheur insoutenable, so unbearable happiness, already contains a whole lot of hints in the title alone, which I think is a decision that is regrettable, I guess. But to close off this, what we can say here is that such a novel has obviously been a source of inspiration for hundreds and thousands of books and films and series afterwards. And at the same time, it also encapsulates themes of its time, ideas of its time. And it is therefore both forward-thinking in some ways and at the same time very much anchored in an era which well, things have changed since then, of course, but more than that, probably, it encapsulates a certain political climate as well, coming out of the Cold War, where the relationship between the two poles of power, USSR and America, were of course very difficult, where the image of the USSR itself was extremely negative, and perceived as the seat of repression where nobody was free, while of course America was seen as the land of the free. All this is also obviously behind such premise, such storyline. And so that reminds us that science fiction, far from being removed from the world, is very much an instrument to reflect on the world, and obviously reflections on the world of the 1970s might not be reflection on the world of 2025. Nevertheless, this novel, while it may not be the best novel ever, while it certainly is not the best novel ever, remains very interesting for being a sort of node between very diffuse ideas found throughout science fiction before the 70s and this mass of science fiction inspired tropes that we will find afterwards many, many times over. So, I can only encourage you to get that one, have a good read, and let me know what you think. Thank you. Bye-bye.